Boa tarde. Boa tarde. Good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to see you here. My name is João Bill. I'm a professor in the Department of Anthropology and also co-director of the Brazil Lab that's sponsoring this event. And I also co-direct the program in Global Health and Health Policy at the Woodrow Wilson School. So it's a great, great pleasure and honor to have Professor José Goldemberg with us today, talking about technological leapfrogging in the Global South, the case of Brazil. Professor Goldemberg is a world-renowned Brazilian scientist and a leading expert on energy and the environment. A member of the Brazilian Academy of Sciences, Goldemberg is also one of Brazil's most influential and dedicated public administrators. He served as Minister of Education, as well as Minister of Science and Technology, as well as Secretary for the Environment in the state of São Paulo, among the many, many public positions he held. We had a wonderful conversation, a brief one, but wonderful conversation outside, and was really refreshing to hear Professor Goldemberg defining the work of being in the world of policy as one, not of being ideological, but being someone who does what necessitates to be done, o que precisa ser feito. He was also, until recently, the president of FAPESP, the São Paulo Research Foundation, and he has been for many years professor of physics. He's now professor of physics emeritus at the University of São Paulo. In the mid-70s, at the height of the military dictatorship in Brazil, he took a leave of absence and he spent some time in Princeton, and that was his first visit, I think, in 1976. The recipient of numerous international awards, Goldemberg has published widely in academia, but also in larger media outlets. And he has published some of the books he published in English include Energy, Environment and Development, and Energy: What Everyone Needs to Know. We are delighted to have with us as a discussant today Professor Eric Larsen. And Eric actually had the idea of organizing this event, and we are deeply grateful, Eric, for bringing the visit of Professor Goldemberg to our attention. He has been working with Professor Goldemberg since the 1980s and has been an active participant in many joint research endeavors. He's a senior research engineer at the Endinger Center for Energy and the Environment and at the Princeton Environmental Institute. He's a professor associated faculty at the Princeton Environmental Institute. Professor Larsen works on energy systems and as they relate to advanced clean energy technologies and processes of carbonaceous fuel conversion, energy-related challenges in developing countries, among other items. So let's give Professor José Goldemberg and Eric Larsen our warmest welcome to Princeton.
Thank you, John. The title that was chosen for my talk is Technological Leapfrogging in the Global South, in the case of Brazil. And what I'd like to tell you is some work that started here at Princeton many years ago. And we have been developing such ideas, and even 40 years ago, I think they are very alive and kicking. And I will try to convince you of that and of the importance of this idea. The basic idea is the following, is that, you can see, this is a paper that was published in 1985. And Thomas Johansson was from Sweden, Amulya Reddy was a person from India, and Robert Williams was a energy analyst working here at Princeton. And what we identified at that time is the fact that in reality, people use a lot more energy than it's needed. And this was 85. It was even more true in 1985 than it is today, because refrigerators used a lot of energy. Lamps were the old style lamps, most of them incandescent lamps and so on. And what we did was an exercise. We said, look, developing countries in general have technology that is old and outdated because of the colonial heritage and all that and so on. You know, when factories became older in England and Germany, sometimes they were shipped to our countries. So the technology was always second rate. So we made an exercise. We said, look, suppose that we were to adopt the best technology available in the United States or in Europe at that time. How much energy would we need to supply reasonable needs of people? And we came out with a number, which is 1 kilowatt. I understand this audience has some engineers and a number of social scientists. But 1 kilowatt per capita means not much more than the energy that we need for heating. For, you know, when you eat, you know, to keep alive and moving around, you need about 2,000 kilocalories per day. If you get more than that, you get fat. If you get less than that, you have problems surviving. This is not much more than the minimum needed. So it's a very reasonable amount of energy. And therefore, the idea was that when you develop in developing countries, you don't have to retrace the steps taken that happened in the past in the industrialized country. You can sort of jump ahead. And that idea was an idea that was developed by our group. We looked into detail. Well, I will, of course, skip the details, but we said, all right, if we talk about cooking, you know, use LPG or use electric cooking. If you are using a refrigerator, don't buy a General Electric model of 1950, but get a model from Sweden, you know, which at that time were the modern refrigerators and so on. And then we look at what the great economist Schumpeter has done. And you know, this kind of thing is well known. You see, this is the long-term evolution. This is the long-term evolution of the industrialized country's energy intensity. You have here tons per $1,000. You know, and here you have 1840 and the year 2000. And this is the trajectory that these countries followed, starting with the UK, which was the first country that industrialized. And what happened is that when you start to industrialize, you use technologies that are very primitive, so you spend a lot of energy to make money. So it's a lot of tons of oil equivalent per $1,000. Then you get smarter, you reach a peak, and then it falls down. Now, when the United States came in 50 years later, it started here, but then it reached a peak after the UK, but the peak is not as high as the UK, as you see here. You know, it's lower because the industrialization benefited from what the British had done before, and so on and so forth. And finally, when Japan came, you see, France is here, and Japan is here. And that was well known at that time. So we said, well, what about developing countries? You know, and the developed countries were here. There was little information on what was going on in the developing countries. And we explored that. And then the idea occurred that, this is a drawing that's very familiar to physicists, you know. Here you have income per capita, and here you have anything. The energy intensity, the energy needed to produce wealth. It can be the environmental impact, the income inequality, and so on. And what you see is that as your income increases, then, for example, if you look at the environmental impact increases. Then you go to a peak, and then you come down. And this is sort of a pretty universal picture. And, you know, the physicists know very well that there is something called tunnel effect, and you can skip some of these steps and jump ahead. And that's the origin of the wording leapfrogging, you know. And we explored that idea, and it proved to be something that really happened. Because if you look at what's happening, what has happened in many developing countries, is that they did jump ahead. And I'm going to show you some examples. Brazil is a good example also, but not only Brazil, many countries adopted strategies that were really following that kind of behavior. Now, what happens in the developing countries, of course, is very important, and it became very important because people at that time, this was more than 30 years ago, were beginning to get rather concerned with carbon emissions. But look at what happened since then. You know, this is 77. The OECD countries were here, and the OECD countries were important emitters. They dominated the picture at that time. Now, when it came to approximately the year 2000, the carbon dioxide emissions in megatons leveled off and is beginning to fall. Not in the developing world, because there is a lot more people in the developing world, and they're industrializing and consuming more. And if they keep consuming more using old-fashioned technologies, then we are going to have a rather dramatic situation. So now it's impossible, of course, to keep countries from developing because they will develop. But what one has to do is to encourage them to develop using technologies that will not damage the environment, and in the particular case of carbon emissions, will not emit a lot of carbon emissions because they already dominate the world situation, as you see here. And then it's all right. What can we do about it? And there is a list of things you can do. The drivers of the reduction of carbon emissions can be organized. There are many ways of organizing a list of drivers, but what I did was to organize them this way. First, you can introduce technological advances in the efficiency of the thermal machines. And this is done currently in the industrialized countries. It was done in the 19th century because the first machines that were developed in the beginning of the Industrial Revolution were very inefficient because the temperature was very low. You know, the Watt machine, which started the Industrial Revolution, had an efficiency of 3%. So you spend a lot of coal or a lot of wood boiling water with a very, very low efficiency. Now these machines, they're still around. They are the prime movers in the world. They have efficiency of 30 to 40%. And so technical advances in the thermal efficiency of machines. So, for example, you go to a generating a coal plant that generates electricity. They have efficiencies of about 30%. And if you use gas, you can have efficiencies that are even higher. Then something that did happen from the beginning of last century, around on the 50s and so on, is that the amount of electricity production in the system increased a lot. Today, 43% of all the energy used in the world is used in the form of electricity. And if you look around your life, you can see daily how much you depend on electricity. You know, of course, transportation. In transportation, we are not there yet. In transportation, we use fossil fuels. But in other activities, industrial activities, use electricity. Then you have renewable energies, which play the role. And then you have the increase in the efficiency of final equipment. And the best example I can give you is lighting. You know, and if you go to your country of origin, there are a number of people from the developing world here. You know, if I go to the small town in which I was born in Rio Grande do Sul, they are probably still using incandescent lights, which produce a lot of heat, you know, but little light. You know, it's a very interesting story, you know, because Edison himself, when he invented these old lamps, he did not want to sell. He wanted to charge the customers by the amount of light produced, not by the amount of electricity consumed. You know, and he failed, which I think was a disaster, because if you are charged by the amount of light produced, that would have been a strong incentive to improve the efficiency. Now, if you charge for the electricity used to produce light, the more electricity you sell, the more electricity you use, the more money the company makes. So it was an argument against that sort of held modernization at that time. And but then you see, well, look at refrigerators today. They are not only nicer, but they use a third of the electricity they used 30 or 40 years ago. And finally, there are the changes in consumption patterns, you know, which I know there are people, this is a part of the humanities sector of Princeton University, and we know all about it, you know. You know, every time you walk around and see bicycles or scooters and things like that and so on, you see that these are changes in behavior, you know, and not eating meat, for example, you know, which is becoming popular, you know. It's a very important change in consumption patterns that can have a very important consequence in reducing carbon emissions, because you need less cattle and so on and so forth. So these are the drivers. It is one way of organizing the drivers. Now, the world energy matrix has not evolved as much as we hoped, you know. In 1973, fossil fuels represented 86% of the energy, of the total energy used in the world. And in 2014, it represented 82%. So there was an improvement. So renewable energies, which are very popular today, and people speak a lot about it, they did not have the impact that one could expect. They will eventually, but I think the importance of the renewable energies in reducing carbon emissions, I think it's overrated, and it's not as big as we wanted. What is important? Well, this is a detail that I think I can skip. What counts is really changes in the way we use energy. So, of course, the ways we produce energy are a factor that reduces emissions, but the way we use energy is dominant. And there are a few examples. This is a list that was made. This is a paper of 2015. It's a follow-up of the old work that we did at the time. And look what it says, that technology leapfrogging has certainly occurred. Developing countries currently use more energy-efficient technologies for steel production and new refrigerators than industrialized countries in the past. And here are some examples. Efficiency of lighting has increased by a factor of 50 in the period from 1900 to 2000, in 1 century. Yeah. New refrigerators in the US use about 1/4 of the energy in 2008 versus 1970. And large improvements for clothes washers, dishwashers, and air conditioners occurred also at the same time. New refrigerators in China consume much less electricity than refrigerators in the US in 1970. And there is a story I want to tell you about that. In Mexico, refrigerators sold before 1980 consume 80% more energy than the latest model. And steel production efficiency in tons of oil equivalent per ton of steel is higher in India, Brazil, Egypt than in Japan, France, or Sweden. Because they're not using Pittsburgh type of steel plant, but they use much more modern technologies. There's a study here on refrigerators that I like to tell you, which I think is I think quite illustrative of the impact that good ideas can make. You know, what happened in the following is that in 1992, the climate convention was adopted in Rio de Janeiro, as you know. It's a very important event in which the countries, all countries of the world, under the auspices of the United Nations, decided that enough is enough and we should do something about reducing the emissions that were changing the composition of the atmosphere. And as João mentioned, I was in the government then, and I was the minister in charge of preparations of the conference, and I went to China because the Prime Minister of China did not want to come to Rio. You know, some countries were resisting because they were suspicious, some of these countries, that this was a plot of the rich countries, you know, to keep them poor. You know, because if you reduce carbon emissions, even they wanted to industrialize, you know, quickly. This was 1992, just before the conference. And the argument was that this was a plot of the imperialistic countries, you know, which wanted to keep them underdeveloped. So I went there and spoke to the Prime Minister. It was Li Peng, the one that suppressed the Tiananmen demonstration of the students, you know. And, you know, I explained, it's very interesting. May I tell you, it's amusing history. I came into the room, you know. The room had basically a throne, you know. It was not a throne because he was not the emperor of China, you know, but it was a typical imperial style, you know. And I came in, you know, dressed as a university professor, and the Prime Minister looked at me and he said, "Well, what can I do for you, Professor?" Which was a way of doing exactly what was done by the kings in the Middle Ages, you know. And I said, "Look, Mr. Prime Minister, I did not come as a university professor, but I came as representative of the government of Brazil, which is, you know, organizing this important conference." And I said, "Well, what can you tell me that might be useful for China?" And I said, "Well, you have to reduce your emissions." He said, "Well, if we reduce this is what you want. You want us to reduce our emissions, so this is going to keep us from developing." I said, that's not true. You know, you can develop and emit less carbon. He said, well, give me an example. And I said, I will. How much energy do refrigerators use in China? He was an engineer, and he knew, you know. And he said, look, moreover, you know, we want every Chinese family to have a refrigerator in China, you know, just like you have in your countries. You know? And we have the right, we have the revolution, the lecture be on Mao Zedong's revolution and so on. And I said, I think that's a great idea, you know. But what model of refrigerator are you introducing in China? He said, General Electric models of 1950. I said, look, Mr. Prime Minister, there are models produced in Sweden. Electrolux was, this is 30 years ago. There are refrigerators made by Electrolux that use half of the energy used by the General Electric refrigerators. And he said, you know, he was really touched by that. And he looked around one of his aides, you know. So let's look at it, you know. So when I found this paper, you know, in 2015, I feel vindicated, you know. I don't know if they did it. If they did it because of that conversation, but what I'm telling you is a conversation that was not reported in the press, you know, at any time, you know. And he came to Rio, and the climate convention was signed. It's not working as well as we wanted it, as you know, but you know, we have not given hopes, of course. Now, the idea then that you can develop and use less energy is a reality. I will just show you one example. And this, I think, is one of the important examples. These are the tons of oil equivalent per ton of crude steel. And these are many countries in the world. This is the GDP per capita. So you look at Egypt here, and it uses approximately 0.1. And you look France here, you see, which is a highly developed country, and they use a lot more energy than that. So it has happened, you know. And this is just an example, but there are many, many examples which can be given. And the concept then of technological leapfrogging is an important one. And I think it, although people they adopted the idea without any theory behind it, you know. I mean, and my interpretation is that in our countries, there are people that are smart enough to make the right choices, you know. And I've been using this argument to influence the government in supporting science and technology, because this is one key reason why we should develop an elite of people in our countries which understands modern technology and can make the choices. So the great difference between what happened in England and Germany and France and the United States in the 19th century is very instructive, you know, because companies, of course, were competing, and technology was developed through competition. However, developing countries have a great advantage. They did not develop, but they can choose from what the others did. And in some cases, they can even go further and develop technologies that are more adequate to their geography and to their living conditions. And probably one of the best examples I can give you of that is again the case of Brazil because of the ethanol program. You know, sugarcane doesn't grow in Europe or in the United States, or very little of it grows in the United States. But it is a very important product, not only of Brazil, but many of the tropical countries. There are about 100 countries around the world that produce sugar because sugar is such an important product. And you can convert the juice of sugarcane into ethanol. People know that because they produce cachaça. You know, even English people, English-speaking people know what cachaça is, and caipirinhas, you know, and that was a very well-established industry in Brazil since colonial times. You know, everyone going to Brazil, we recommend strongly also, isn't it? Everybody.
Brazil official.
Everybody going.
Giving us ideas. O senhor está nos dando ideias.
Yes. And, but of course, ethanol from sugarcane, you know, can be easily made. It's a chemical operation that's quite easy. You know, instead of producing sugar, you produce ethanol. But of course, it's expensive. You know, you go and buy a bottle of ethanol, it will cost $1 or so, or several dollars. It's a drink. It's like whiskey, not as expensive as whiskey, but expensive. It turns out that if you produce large quantities, the cost comes down. And that's what happened. And we did that, you know. And it's again interesting because our department at the university was an important element of this technological revolution because the people at the university trained the people that were operating these mills. And the result is a very interesting one. Let me skip some of this stuff that's not relevant to this discussion. Look what happened. This is the cumulative production of ethanol here. And this is the cost in dollars per gigajoule. It's one of these crazy units that physicists use, but it's dollars per given amount of thing. And you see, in 1976, when the program started, it was very expensive. You see, this is gasoline. You know, this is the cost of gasoline for the same amount of energy. So in 1976, when the program started, it was absurd to produce ethanol if you wanted to replace gasoline in your car. It was 8 times more expensive. But as soon as we started producing large quantities, you know, look at what happened. The cost came down, and eventually, in the year 2006, it crossed over. And this is what we call a learning curve, which you find not in all areas, in all technological areas, but you find in most technological areas. And you know, cellular phones are an example of that. You know, 10 years ago, the cost was very high. Now you know, you can get one very cheaply. Of course, the producers of cellular phones add a lot of junk, you know, which is to make it more expensive, you know. But basically, you know, the cost has declined tremendously, you know. And the same thing happened with I think this is a wonderful example of technological leapfrogging because the United States started a program producing ethanol from corn in the year 2000, much later than the United States. So the idea that the United States comes first has to be considered with some caution, you know. And they are producing more ethanol than Brazil today, but they started later. And it's a wonderful example of leapfrogging. And there are other areas, of course, in which countries can use their natural resources to jump ahead. Of course, to do that in this way, as we did, you have to have the right climate. For example, sugarcane in Brazil does not need irrigation. It grows without irrigation. That's one of the reasons why the price declined. In Colombia, the sugarcane that is grown there is better than the sugarcane grown in Brazil, but it needs irrigation, and therefore it's more expensive. So it depends where you are. And the problem, of course, is to identify the good opportunities to do it. And as a result of all that, Brazil today is a country that is reasonably well developed, and it's not an important emitter of CO2. You see here, you see this is 1990, this is 2014. And these are the CO2 emissions in kilograms per unit of GDP. And of course, Brazil developed tremendously since 1990. This is a 25-year period. And the what you call the energy intensity, the carbon emissions per unit of GDP remain approximately constant. What intuition will tell you is that since it's industrialized a lot, it would go up. It didn't, because it uses renewable energy, and among the renewable energies, there is hydro, of course, and ethanol. Gasoline in Brazil has been replaced, not completely, but to a large extent by ethanol. If the ethanol program did not exist in Brazil, Brazil would be consuming twice the amount of gasoline we use today. So it's an important method of driving cars without important emissions. The reason why ethanol is carbon-free is that, of course, when you burn ethanol in your automobile, there's a chemical reaction, you know, and CO2 is emitted. But 6 months later, that CO2 is recaptured when the sugarcane grows again. So it goes into a cycle, and it's a renewable fuel, almost a complete renewable fuel. And so it can be done. And that's the message. You know, there are more details in this presentation. You are welcome to have it. You know, I will leave it here. But I think the message I wanted to convey to you is that technological leapfrogging is something that originated actually here at Princeton 40 years ago, you know, with Rob Sokolov and Bob Williams and our colleagues. And then we identified many examples that it was happening in the world. And in addition to that, we introduced new ones. So it shows that the importance, and I've been using this argument as an educator at the University of São Paulo, that you need well-trained people. I mean, a country needs well-trained people to identify these opportunities. You know, and it did happen. I'll give you only some examples, but for example, the pulp and paper industry in Brazil is superb, better than the same industry in Sweden, for several reasons. But one of them is because trees in Brazil, they grow much more quickly than trees in Sweden. You know, but still, if they had not adopted modern technologies, they would be wasting a lot of that advantage, and other countries have been doing that. So I think what we have done not only shows that you can develop without destroying the environment. Amazonia is a different problem, and we won't discuss it here today.
Yeah, of course.
But ethanol has nothing to do with sugarcane. Has nothing to do with in Amazonia. Sugarcane does not grow in the wet forest area, and I think the examples I have given show the importance of good training of science and technology and education. So that's the message I want to convey.
It's wonderful.
Well, it's an honor and a privilege to share the podium with José, who I've known now for, I guess, 36 years. I started here in Princeton in 1983 as a postdoc, and it was really a second PhD that I was getting after my mechanical engineering PhD by working with José, Bob Williams, Thomas Johansson, and Amelia Reddy on a book which is called Energy for a Sustainable World, which had a huge impact, I think, and many of the ideas that José was talking about here are reflected in that book. For the first half of my career, I was spending a lot of time working on energy issues in developing countries, and in Brazil in particular, working on bioenergy technologies for the sugarcane industry, among others. And it was an opportunity to observe José as he went through careers in industry, in government, in academia, and just an amazing individual and accomplished individual. And the first time I visited Brazil was 1984. José was president of the Companhia Energia
Energética
de São Paulo, CESP, the energy company of São Paulo. And among other things that he did as the president of that company was to electrify the favelas, and just ordered that they should be electrified because that would raise the living standard in the favelas. And that concern for the poor, as well as what he's articulated about the importance of science and technology, those features of his of who he is really came out in some of the things that I observed. He also, as a minister, I think, did some very incredible things to slow the deforestation of the Amazon back in the 80s, I guess it was late 80s.
91, 92.
91, 92,
Yes.
yeah. So
You follow that.
Yeah, it was a strong reduction at that time of
Yeah.
deforestation.
yeah,
So,
so
let me interrupt you.
please.
It shows that it can be done.
Yeah.
Of course, the government didn't last. Changes in government occur for many reasons. And the government was changed and our effort was abandoned. But it shows that in 1 or 2 years, you can reduce deforestation.
Yeah, and so just picking up on some of the things that you spoke about in your talk, I think energy efficiency is as important, if not more important today, given the sort of the advanced state of the climate problem that is even more accelerated than what we realized back in the 1980s, I think. And I think that's one area where there needs to be continued science and technology development. In the ethanol program, you didn't mention, José, but another important aspect of that is increasingly now being used in Brazil, I think, is the use of the fiber that comes from the sugarcane to make electricity, renewable electricity, and put that into the grid. So the sugar industry is providing both fuel for vehicles and electricity for the grid, both renewable, which is not being done anywhere anywhere else, even, I think. So that's another example of the leapfrogging. I think I'll throw out 3 questions, and you can, I'll ask the questions and then I'll let you respond to them. So one point you made about, you said renewables today they're not much further along than they were in the 1970s in terms of the matrix, the global energy matrix, and you didn't think that they were going to have, I don't remember exactly how you put it, but you downplayed the renewables a bit. But at the same time, Brazil must be 70–80% renewable energy. So one question I would have is how replicable do you think that model is of Brazil to other developing countries? A second question. So you started your talk with a discussion of the 1 kilowatt per capita analysis that showed that you could, with very relatively little energy, you could bring the living standard, provide a basic living for the poor populations. If we fast forward to today, I think the number of people who are at that same level of poverty probably hasn't changed very much from back then, because the population has gone up so much. And there's a lot of people who argue that using fossil fuels to bring those poorest people out of poverty should not be done because of the carbon problem. And so I guess the question is, how do you feel about using fossil fuels to bring people out of poverty? The last question I had was about the last graph you showed that showed the kilograms of CO2 emissions per GDP for Brazil has been constant over time. The earlier graph you showed for countries it would typically go up and then it would come down. So will it come down further in Brazil? Is a question over time as things change in the country. So those are just a few thoughts.
Okay. Let me reply quickly to this. Starting with this one. What we found, not only for Brazil, but in other developing countries, there is no more peak. They are past the peak. They are all in the declining region. You know, only very few countries in Africa are countries that are, while developing, are increasing their emissions. So they were all past the peak. And of course, the danger in Brazil is that the population is growing, people are getting richer and all that and so on, is that they will start using more energy and then the emissions would increase. That's what we are fighting against today. And the fact that they have been kept constant, I think it's a great achievement, you know. And of course, this has to do with hydroelectric resources, you know, and that answers another question, you know. One of the reasons why Brazil was fortunate is because it has hydropower in large amount. But many countries have hydropower, you know. The African countries have an enormous potential for hydroelectricity. Of course, there are problems, environmental problems. I mean, you cannot go to a country and build a hydropower plant the way you did in the past, you know, sort of brute force. But you have to take great care not to destroy the environment and all that and so on. But I am a firm believer that a lot of hydropower could be used in developing countries. Certainly in Latin America. Latin America is well endowed with hydroelectric because of the Andes. You know, all the countries along the are benefiting from the snow that is converted into water, and which ultimately feeds the Amazon. Mm-hmm. And let's see what.
Last question about poverty and fossil fuels.
That's a tough question. Let me tell you, story. Old people tell stories, you know.
We love it. We love
Yeah.
it.
Eric, in one of the conferences on the climate convention, you know, which I attended, you know, I was explaining some of this, you know, and the head of an African country, you know, which I can't remember now, it was one of the small republics in Africa. He said exactly that. He was, Li Peng, the Chinese were more sophisticated, you know, but he made the same question that you did. He said, look, the only way we get out is to use carbon, you know, because it's, produce electricity, burning coal and all that stuff, because it's a cheap technology and it's risk adverse. There are no risks involved. And you want us to use windmills and photovoltaics and so on. That's a scientist's dream and all that and so on. It's not going to work. This was 20 years ago. Now, no one would say that anymore, you know. So I think that's the answer, you know. It's depending on the country, of course. You can go straight to some of these renewables, you know. In the northeast of Brazil, wind is becoming a very important source of energy. And in some European, you know, Spain, in Spain, 30 or 40% of the electricity is produced from renewable sources. Okay.
Excellent. So let's open questions. Okay. Yes. Say your name.
Okay, my name is Romulo, and then I have a question about I think that we missed a great opportunity recently for like in terms of the ethanol program. I mean, we gave the wrong incentives in terms of like energy planning in Brazil. And I'm really sad about that because actually where I came from, I'm a professor at Rutgers, but where I came from is the energy planning program, right, at COP. So which is basically responsible for most of the things that we did in terms of like wrong incentives about the ethanol, which is, you mentioned about the leapfrog, right? So, but basically, my question is related to that. It's because we probably have the largest amount of lignocellulosic raw material in the whole world, right? Which is the sugarcane bagasse. And now we need another leapfrog. And I don't know if you're gonna actually be able to use the new technologies like for biorefineries, right? Not like by using like these two different routes, a thermochemical and biochemical. I don't know which one is better, but anyway. So do you think you're gonna be capable to basically, I mean, use like recover this time that we basically lost, right?
Look, would be wonderful, you know, if we could use lignocellulose. Lignocellulose is trees, you know, any green stuff you find, you know, including urban refuse and all that and stuff. Would be wonderful. And people have been trying hard in the last 10 years, you know, and they have not succeeded. You know, technology is great, you know, but some technology don't work as well as we expected, you know. So far, there was no success in large scale. It's interesting, you know, because a lot of effort was made in this question, you know. What happens is if you can use lignocellulose in the chemistry department, you know, and convert it to wonderful ethanol, you know. As soon as you go to the field, you know, in large scale, it doesn't work because lignocellulose is used, the amounts are huge and it's full of impurities, you know, sand, snakes, you know, and, you know, the amounts involved are millions of tons, you know, and the industrial equipment that was built for that purpose has not worked well so far. So it's an open question, you know. Eventually one might solve the problem, but my estimate is that $1 billion has been spent in 4 or 5 plants around the world. One of them in Brazil, and the others in, I think two in the United States, one in Holland and so on, and none of them succeeded. But it is a very good question because, you know, sugarcane doesn't grow in many countries, you know, and then you are worried, you know, if you expand sugarcane production, you know, you are going to, you know, you will not be able to use the land for other productive purposes, you know. It's a serious question, you know. So lignocellulose would be wonderful, but unfortunately, we didn't learn how to do it.
So, leapfrogging and the Amazon.
Yeah.
So we'd like to hear a little bit from, even though it's not an area that necessarily working in now, like, how would you think of what's possible, given the Brazil's experience, which has been very positive in several areas, in terms of advancing the cause of deforestation zero? Which kind of initiatives could be rolled out economically, technologically, that might enhance the possibility of survival of the Amazon?
Look, João, the problem is the following, is that two problems. The region, Amazon is an immense region. You know, people don't have an idea of the size of the place. When you fly from São Paulo to New York, as I did, you know, last weekend, you know, you fly 4 hours over solid forest, you know, 4 hours. You know. So it's an immense region. And the first problem is following, is that government is absent from the Amazon. Public actors. Public actors means police, judges, social workers and all that. They are absent. You know? I mean, there are a large population which is spread out. Not only Indians, but other groups that migrated from other, and the poder público, poder público? Public sector, public office.
The government.
Yeah, is absent.
Right, of government.
And the land is there. It's has a zero cost. You know, so anyone living in one of those small villages, you know, there are many villages. As a shopkeeper, or as a side activity, you know, you would go and cut trees, you know, and sell it in the black market. You know, and what we did in 1990, you know, when I was in government, was to try to put public sector there, you know, and which means police and spread out the idea that police was watching. You know, now it's possible. Now it improved a lot, you know, because you have satellites. You can see it on real time, you know, if they're burning something. But we did those demonstrations. And what we would do, there is a lot of illegal mining, you know. What we would do is bomb some of these
Gold mining, especially gold mining.
yes, these lanes in which these small airplanes. We did that. It was great publicity, you know. You know, we didn't hurt anyone, you know. We just bombed some of them, and so as soon as
Illegal infrastructure.
as soon as
Infrastructure of illegality, yeah.
as soon as the presence of the state appears, you reduce activity. But it's very attractive, you know, because the cost is small. You know, I mean, you cut some trees. There are wonderful trees there, and you sell them illegally. You know, and so the first answer is that you have to increase the presence of the public sector. That's the first one. And the second one, which is, I think, more rational, is following. In the places that are more developed, people are learning that you don't have to cut all that land. You see, for cattle, for example, you know, Brazilian cattle is the most comfortable cattle in the world. You know, each head of cattle has 1 hectare at its disposal.
Yeah.
You know, that's the number. This is absurd. You know, you can have 10 heads of cattle in 1 hectare. You know, it's, of course, in Switzerland you have more, but in Brazil you can have 10 of them. And this is happening in some states. For example, in Mato Grosso, which is a place where there is a lot of cattle, people are learning that it is a good idea. You know, even economically it makes sense, because they don't have to transport cattle to very long distances. You know? So there are economic factors going in that direction. But what has to be done is to discourage people in destroying the forest. And that's what governments do, you know, including the present people in government are giving mixed signals, which is the worst thing they could do. You know, they say, well, you know, IBAMA is the organization that is supposed to watch over the way land is used. IBAMA and the other organizations, they are, the present government is arguing that there is an industry of fines, that you fine too much. It's the wrong message, you know. They want to stop the people from applying fines. You know, it serves no purpose except encouraging people to do these illegal activities. So it's a question of moving into legality, you know. I think as soon as you move, because it's unnecessary to cut the forest, and in economic terms, it's becoming it's not good for business.
Yeah.
To destroy. Now, a lot of harm was done already. That's the problem. About 50, you know the numbers better than I do. About 15% of the forest.
Now it's coming to 21%.
Huh?
21% now.
Okay.
It's gone.
21 has been destroyed, so it has to be recovered. Now that's more complicated. To recover the forest, it's more complicated, but nature is kind. You know,
Resilient.
there are methods of recovering the forest. And actually, if you leave it alone for a while, it will recover to some extent, except if they
The large areas.
destroy it
The seed bank.
scientifically.
Yeah,
You know,
okay.
in São Paulo, again, São Paulo is a place which is more developed, therefore, poder público. How would they say it
Public
in
prosecutors.
But the presence of the government.
English? President of the state.
State,
Yeah.
the role of
The
the rule of
president
law
of
in
the
the
state.
state.
São Paulo is more developed. The president of the state is everywhere. You know, you go to any God-forsaken small village, you know, there is a policeman, there is a judge, there is, you know, the state is there. The Mata Atlântica was recovered. This is not the Amazon, but the
Forest.
the forest, the Portuguese destroyed, you know, that's being recovered. The state of São Paulo is a good example that recovery is possible.
Questions, yes, please, and then Marina.
Do you think countries in, say, Africa or Southeast Asia should be pushing towards replicating the Brazilian model to produce bioethanol, or should governments there be giving more incentives and subsidies for sugarcane production?
Esse modelo do Brasil, if the Brazilian model of the sugarcane and ethanol could be replicated in other countries with similar climate.
Yeah, in Africa.
Yeah.
Africa.
Yeah, in some African countries, yes, absolutely. Mozambique which is a very large country. You know, some of these countries in Africa are immense. You know? Mozambique has very good conditions for growing sugarcane and producing ethanol. Actually, some Brazilian companies have started doing that. There is a problem with African countries, you know, because of the liberation wars and so on. The land belongs to the government. There is a question of land ownership that's very complicated, you know, and the land does not belong to individuals. So you cannot purchase, in some countries you cannot purchase land and so on. So I try to understand why wasn't this spreading out in Africa, you know? And they tell me that one of the great problems is the question of land ownership.
The government's given off incentives.
Yes. Now, in other countries, for example, Indonesia, which is very large too, the problem is different because sugarcane doesn't grow well, but palm oil does, and it can be used to replace diesel. Then they're cutting the forest in a miserable way. You know, I mean, really raising it. Now that you cannot do, you know, and so there is a problem. But I'm pretty sure that Indonesia is the same problem. It's the absence of the state.
Okay, Marina?
Hi, thank you for your talk. It was really amazing. I'm just thinking it's going to
Louder.
It's going to be a humanities question. Because I was thinking about sugarcane in terms of the past of Brazil and the future, and we can also connect it to Africa, I think. So one way is like looking back, like the whole colonial history of the plantations and monoculture in Brazil. And the other thing would be looking towards the future. How do we think about technology and labor? I guess it's a question about labor. So in terms of how do we bring technology to this context in which like labor tends to disappear or to vanish, right? Because like one of the big problems that we have now in like the developed countries is like there are no jobs, right? Because you replace everything for technology. So how do we think about the environment and technology and then labor and people?
You know, in the case of sugarcane, which involves large areas, you know, we had a lot of these problems, you know. We had the boias frias, you know. These are seasonal laborers, like the Mexicans that come to
Migrant laborers.
laborers.
Day laborers.
Yeah, because the methods of cutting the sugarcane were very primitive. You know, they were using manual methods of cutting the cane with machetes and things like that. And all kinds of social problems. You know, there were lots of complaints or children working. You know, questions about children and stuff. I was the one that had to solve that problem. I'm not sure I did the right thing. We mechanized the system, you know, and it's completely mechanized in Brazil. It led to some unemployment, you know, but the jobs, there are a smaller number of people employed in the sugarcane industry, but the jobs are better. And you know, the unions didn't like it at all, you know. But I think it's the cost of progress, you know. And eventually, what happened is that the system expanded, and the people were employed because of the expansion of the system. But per hectare, we stimulated unemployment, which is a terrible thing, you know. But it's the cost of progress.
Questions? Yes, Lorraine?
So we talked about the poor and carbon emissions, but what do you think about the possible necessity for wealthy nations to drastically alter their lifestyles and, you know, maybe like in the future we would have to fly a lot less than we do now, et cetera? Do you think that that's a necessity if we want to control climate change?
Well, it's happening, you know. But it's not a technological question. Technologists are no good to respond to that question. You know, it's a question of culture, you know, and cultural values. You know, I think it's happening. You know? Well, not with travel, you know, because airplanes are becoming a major source of emissions, you know. But look, this movement against using meat is increasing, you know. I mean, there are countries in Europe, you know, in which organic agriculture and things like that are really catching up, you know. So I think it's something that will happen. You know, I'm told, you know, you're all much younger than I am. I'm told that young people are giving up automobiles. They don't like automobiles as they used to. You know, I noticed that with some of our young students. You know, they like to take a bicycle, you know, or walk, or take the metro. And one of them was a secretary that was working with me, and she was always late, you know. And I said, "Oh Christ, you know, I mean, why don't you take an Uber, take a car?" It said, "Look, I have enough money to buy an automobile, but it's a choice. I don't want to do it." You know? I think this is increasing around the world. And of course, it's going to have a tremendous impact, but it's a slow process.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any model country that you look at? So besides Brazil, the advancements in the past, you know, that can, you know, that are lessons to be learned and show that there are reversals, innovation comes from other places. Are there some countries that
The developing side,
that spark your imagination? I'm thinking of Uruguay, wind energy, which is massive there. They even are exporting.
Yes.
I just want, and you know, I just was wondering if you're seeing countries in which a larger scale experiments are happening. I'm just asking of my own ignorance.
Yeah, look, Latin America is the region of the world that I know best. You know. Chile is doing very well. And Chile solved the educational problem. The Argentinians have too, you know, but the Argentinians they came from Spain, you know, so it's an impossible country, you know. They fight too much. But Chile, I think, is a good example of a country that really succeeded. Actually, I said that, but I'm going to repeat it. I think that to have a revolution of any kind, including the cultural revolution, you need education has an essential role. And since we are talking about complicated matters, it means universities, not only basic education, but higher education. It's interesting. You know, you know, in one of the problems we had at one time in São Paulo, the governor asked me, you know, we spend a lot of money with the University of São Paulo, you know, it's a huge university. You know? Some of you know about the university, others don't. It has 100,000 students.
It's a city.
Yeah, you know, can you imagine? And the governor said, look, we are spending a lot of money with the university. So what are you giving us in return? You know, and I said, look, the University of São Paulo was established in 1934. Since then, the number of people that graduated from the University of São Paulo is approximately 300,000. And I said, look around. I told the governor, look around. Who are the people that are helping? You know, secretaries, you know, important people in the administration, banks and all that. They all came from our university, you know? Because, you know, over the years we produced 300,000 people. which are the presidents of companies, banks, and all that stuff. So it's difficult to measure in economic terms, but that's what changes the state. This is why the state of São Paulo is more developed, because the university has been there for many years, almost a century, 85 years now.
Mm-hmm.
And the other states have universities which have been established much more recently.
Yes, please.
So,
Marcelo.
We talked about the energy market, a bit like consumption patterns, right? I want to ask if you see room for maybe policy kind of general markets, or production industry, or maybe how, given that companies are those that pollute the most as compared to households, right? What is your take, or because I think right now we're putting a lot of effort and emphasis on how individuals are supposed to cut emissions, eat less meat, travel less, right? But I don't think we're not looking up at companies and factories, and I want to what do you think about that?
Ele está perguntando, a gente coloca o foco na mudança do indivíduo, mudança cultural e tal, mas companhias, como é que elas
Okay, I missed one word, that's why I never.
Yes, yeah, got it.
Look, these companies didn't get it. I mean, they're pushing. It's amazing the amount of publicity on automobiles in Brazil. You get the newspaper, or anything, and any journal or any magazine, has pages and pages of advertising automobiles, and then with all kinds of financial schemes that you don't have for other things. The rate of interest is 0. It's all fake, I mean, you end up paying somehow, but the advertisement is fantastic. I'm always amazed, which I think goes exactly counter. It's against, and if you put lots of automobiles out, then the government has to build more roads, congestion is terrible, and all that stuff. But these things are happening. The former mayor of São Paulo, not the president, but the former, he introduced lanes for bicycles, and it worked. He introduced lots of lanes, which I think it was an overshoot. But then the reality readjusts things. There are 3 or 4 very important street avenues in São Paulo in which you see lots of bicycles in a period of 4 years. And it was very ambitious. It did put lanes everywhere. That's
What's the Fernanda, I know the candidate against the current.
So you're quite right. I don't think the companies got it.
If I may ask, what do you think the role of the government is in there? Is the government to intervene more, to be more active, to taxing more?
Yeah, sure, but in elections in developing, the United States became underdeveloped. You know that the United States is in the same category. Populism is a tremendous has a tremendous influence in elections. And the government doesn't do it because it's unpopular with some sectors. But I don't have to. You have the experience in the United States, which is great, because you understand what problems we face.
And I will go to Marcelo, but along those lines, maybe Beto, if you want to come in too, given the difficulty of technological solutions to the question of carbon emissions, right? Can companies do something else? There are conversations about offsetting environmental costs, for example, making pools of money to maybe purchase areas to support so that people would not deforest them. So is there something, do you think, that at that level, political, economic, that could be done in the absence of of immediately actionable technologies to deal with this question of carbon sequestration?
Well, I think in the case of the forest, yes. You know, I mean, there is a promise. Brazil has committed itself to reforest 12 million hectares, which is good.
Yeah.
You know, it has not been implemented. And one
But
knows
still
about
But it's at least there. That was a good target, and they're
Yeah.
moving.
Yeah, it's, one can estimate the cost. It's not so high, it's affordable. You know, I think that as the pressure, you know, as people become more worried about global warming, I think these things will put an enormous pressure in the government to do it.
But I don't think it'll bring the industries in to participate, which is what you were
Yeah.
suggesting, unless there's a business case for them,
Yeah,
right?
that's right.
So
But
it's really a
It
government,
will have to be by law. I mean, it will be
just public policy.
Public policy.
But the whole question of, say, the carbon sequestration, the storage, that's technology it's coming probably, but it maybe take 10, 15 years. Up to there, we have to keep at the forest as much as we can. So the oil companies are considering, as I know, create like a fund that actually is going to support restoration and forest conservation. So, and that has to buy time until the technology for capture
But
carbon.
it's public policy.
Yeah.
Then it's public policy.
Yeah. And also the oil company seems to, at least as we have understand, trying to put some, not some money, a lot of money in this game. So I want to understand a little bit more. But maybe it's another conversation.
So, Professor, thanks for your talk. It's great to hear from you. I would like just ask one thing about the perspective of somebody that have passed through many governments, and we know that this actual government, as we are talking here, have a strong position in defunding not only research made inside the academia, but also it's like a government that it's based on theological concept of its own role as a government. So it's pretty much against what we are talking here, which is like the knowledge that it's produced in USP, inside the academia, thinking about technological development, right? I would ask you if you, what is your impression about this government right now? And because generations, like young generations are pretty much skeptical about their, what it's going to happen in the future, immediate future with this government.
Well, look, it's a new government. It was elected a few months ago, and it's started in January, you know, so only 3 months have elapsed, you know. So it's very difficult to evaluate what they will do. The rhetoric is awful, but that we learn, you know. You are learning too, you know. Usually in the past, you know, we were giving examples of Venezuela, Argentina, and so on. Now the United States is a very good example, you know, of rhetoric, you know, that the campaign and the statements since they were elected are not good. You know, they don't seem to understand the importance of science, technology. They think money is being wasted and this and that and so on. But reality, there are some realities. You sit on that chair, you know, and you learn, you know. So I think they're beginning to understand what are the limitations of their power, which is exactly what happened in the United States, you know. I mean, you know, looking from the outside, we thought that the EPA was going to, the Environmental Protection Agency was going to be disbanded, because that was one of the ideas, you know, that proposals were made by the with the government to close EPA or to curtail dramatically its activity. It didn't happen. And so I would say the jury is still out, but the indications are not good.
And do you think what then is the difference of the United States and Brazil? Because there is a dismantling going on by the Trump administration to a certain extent, but there are institutions that can resist or are in place. Which institutions does Brazil have to resist the dismantling?
On that I am optimist. Because I think so far the institutions are resisting very well. The Supreme Court has been quite all right. There were ideas of like the ones expanding there are 11 judges. In the United States, it's nine. There are 11. One of the proposals was to increase to 20. And then
Appoint
Theologians.
it went nowhere. So I think we are resisting, and the opposition in Congress is not negligible. There is a large number of members of parliament that. The election was 55 to 45, so there is a strong opposition. But, I think we'll be able to resist.
On that note, that you think we will be able to resist, right? We want to thank you so much, Professor Goldberg. You are awesome.